On my wedding day, my father whispered, "You're just like your mother, weak." He abandoned us years ago, never looked back. As the officiant asked, "Who gives this bride away?" A voice rang out. "I do. My mother's long-lost brother. A billionaire." Dad went pale. I never expected to see him again. Not after the night he walked out, leaving my mother and me behind with nothing but an empty bank account and broken hearts. Not after years of silence, as if we never existed. But there he was, standing in the front row of my wedding like he had every right to be there. His suit was pressed, his smirk was the same, and his eyes, cold, assessing, landed on me as if I were just another thing he had once owned. I forced myself to breathe. This day wasn't about him. It was about me, about my future. The officiant smiled warmly at me. "Who gives this bride away?" A pause, a beat of silence too long. Then my father stepped forward. I flinched before I could stop myself. He leaned in, voice low enough for only me to hear. "You're just like your mother. Weak." A knife to my ribs would have hurt less. The officiant cleared his throat, oblivious. My father straightened, smug satisfaction written all over his face. My grip on the bouquet tightened. My world started tilting, until another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I do." Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I turned too, because that voice wasn't one I recognized. A man stepped forward. Tall. Confidence. A presence that filled the space. He looked older, mid-40s maybe, but sharp. A tailored suit, the kind that screamed wealth. His eyes were familiar, though. The same warmth, the same quiet strength that I used to see in my mother's when she held me after nightmares. "My name is Samuel Carter," he announced, his voice smooth but firm. "And this young woman is my niece." Niece? The room erupted into whispers. My father went pale. I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind raced, piecing together a puzzle I never knew existed. My mother never spoke of any siblings. Never mentioned this man. But something about the way he was looking at me, like I mattered, made me want to believe him. Samuel turned to me. "Your mother was my sister." His voice softened. "I've been looking for you." My heart stuttered. My father recovered fast. His shock melted into something darker, something ugly. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You have no right to be here." Samuel didn't even blink. "And you do." The tension was suffocating. My father's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. For the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Fear. "Why?" Samuel turned back to me. "May I?" I swallowed hard, nodded. With quiet authority, he took my arm. He smelled like expensive cologne and something else. "Safety." The officiant, stunned but quick to recover, continued. I barely heard the words. My mind was spinning. My father didn't try to stop him. Didn't say another word. But I saw his fingers twitch at his sides. The way his lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't done. Not yet. And for the first time since he walked out of our lives, I wasn't scared of him. But maybe I should have been. Because something told me this was only the beginning. Samuel's grip on my arm was firm but steady. A silent promise. A shield between me and the man who once called himself my father. I should have been relieved. Should have felt something close to peace as the officiant continued the ceremony. But my mind was a battlefield, torn between the weight of my past and the mystery of the man who had just claimed to be my uncle. I stole a glance at Samuel. He stood tall beside me, his expression unreadable. But beneath the calm exterior, I sensed something, tension, restraint, as if he were holding back more than just words. My father hadn't moved from his spot. He stood rigid, his hands still clenched at his sides. And then, just as suddenly as he had arrived, he turned on his heel and walked out. No words, no final glare, just gone. The tightness in my chest loosened, but only slightly. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I barely heard the vows. My own voice sounded distant, robotic, as I repeated the words that should have been the most important in my life. The reception was a blur of faces and voices. Guests came up to congratulate me, but my mind was elsewhere. On Samuel, on my father's reaction, on the years of silence my mother had kept about her past. I finally caught Samuel alone near the bar, sipping a whiskey like he owned the place. Maybe he did. He looked like the kind of man who could buy an entire ballroom just because he liked the chandeliers. I approached cautiously. "Why didn't my mother ever mention you?" He turned to me, studying me with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Because she was trying to protect you." A chill ran down my spine. "From what?" Samuel swirled his drink, the ice clinking softly. "Your father." The words settled between us, heavy and unshakable. I swallowed hard. "What do you know about him?" A beat, then another. Finally, he exhaled. "More than you do." Not the answer I wanted. But before I could press further, another voice cut in. "I thought you might say that." I stiffened. Him. My father had returned. He stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable, but the darkness in his eyes made my stomach turn. Samuel remained perfectly still, perfectly calm. "You always did have a habit of eavesdropping." My father's lip curled. And you always did have a habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. I glanced between them. You two know each other. Samuel didn't deny it. My father let out a humorless laugh. Of course we do. He took a slow step forward, his gaze locked on Samuel. Tell me, dear brother-in-law, have you told her everything yet? Or are you still keeping secrets, just like my darling wife? The air in the room turned electric. My pulse pounded in my ears. Brother-in-law? I turned to Samuel, my voice barely above a whisper. You were married to my mother's sister? Samuel's jaw tensed. A muscle in his temple ticked. Not exactly. My father smirked. Go on, Sam. Tell her the truth. Samuel exhaled through his nose, setting his drink down with a quiet clink. Then, finally, he met my eyes. I was in love with your mother. The world tilted. No, no, that couldn't be right. My mother had never mentioned anyone, never spoken of another man, never once hinted at a past love, let alone someone like him. I shook my head. That's not possible. Samuel's gaze softened. I loved her, and she loved me. But your father, enough. My father's voice was sharp, almost panicked. This isn't your story to tell. Samuel didn't even blink. It's hers to know. The room was spinning. I needed air. I needed answers. But before I could demand them, before I could process the weight of what had just been said, a crash. A scream. I whipped around just in time to see a body collapse onto the floor. The room erupted into chaos. And just like that, my wedding night turned into something far more sinister. The moment the body hit the floor, the entire ballroom erupted into chaos. Guests gasped, chairs screeched against marble, and someone shrieked loud enough to send a shiver down my spine. I turned toward the commotion, heart pounding, breath shallow. A man lay sprawled near the dessert table, his glass shattered beside him, deep red wine bleeding into the pristine white tablecloth. His hands clawed at his throat, his eyes wide and frantic. A gurgling noise rattled in his chest. I took a shaky step forward. Poison. Samuel was already moving, barking orders to the staff. Call an ambulance. Now. My father stood motionless, his face unreadable, but I saw it. The flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? Regret? Guilt? No, that couldn't be right. Who is he? I asked, barely hearing my own voice over the panicked murmurs around me. Samuel knelt beside the man, pressing his fingers to his neck. Robert Finch. His voice was grim. Your father's former business partner. I snapped my head toward my father. His fists were clenched, his lips pressed so tightly together they had gone white. Not a flicker of shock. Just quiet, simmering rage. Dad, my voice wavered. What the hell is going on? He didn't answer. Didn't even look at me. Samuel rose to his feet. Adjusting his cuffs like this wasn't the first time he'd seen a man collapse in front of him. I think we both know what this is. My father exhaled sharply through his nose. Don't start, Samuel. But Samuel didn't back down. Finch was involved in your little schemes, wasn't he? And now he's dead. My stomach turned. My father met Samuel's gaze, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. You always did love twisting a story, didn't you? Samuel smirked, but there was no humor in it. And you always did love eliminating problems before they could speak. The words were casual. Too casual. Like they weren't just accusations, but statements of fact. I could barely process what was happening. 1 second, I had been walking down the aisle. Next, a man was gasping for breath at my wedding reception, and my father was exchanging loaded words with the uncle I had just met. Something much bigger was happening here. The paramedics arrived, shoving through the stunned crowd. They worked fast, assessing, stabilizing, but the tension never left the room. Even after they wheeled Finch away, the suffocating air remained. My father exhaled, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. I have nothing to do with this. Samuel chuckled under his breath. You have everything to do with this. My father turned to me then. His expression softened, no, shifted, as if he had just remembered I was still standing there. Come with me, he said, voice low, coaxing. We need to talk. Every instinct screamed at me to say no. I took a step back. Talk about what? His lips parted, but Samuel's voice cut in first. About what he's been hiding from you. I turned to Samuel. Then you tell me. Samuel hesitated for the first time that night. Not because he didn't have answers, but because he was weighing something, deciding how much to tell me. That hesitation sent a ripple of fear down my spine. You were never supposed to know, Samuel finally said. Your mother, she kept you away from it. From him. I gritted my teeth. From what? Samuel's jaw tightened. From the family business. The room blurred for a second. No. My father let out a low, humorless laugh. So you finally said it. I turned back to him, my entire body locking up. What does that mean? Samuel looked me dead in the eye. Your father isn't just a liar, sweetheart. His voice was quiet, but lethal. He's a criminal. I staggered. The room tilted, and suddenly everything made sense. The way my mother never spoke about him. The way she always looked over her shoulder. The secrecy. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Sam. But Samuel wasn't done. You think Finch's death was a coincidence? His voice sharpened. This isn't over. And if you think for 1 second that the past won't come for you, he stopped. Because my father had taken a step forward. Not toward him. Toward me. His face softened again, just slightly, but I wasn't falling for it this time. You don't understand, he murmured. I did it all for you. Coldness dripped down my spine. I took another step back, my voice barely above a whisper. Did what? A beat. Then, with a tired smile, he said, everything. The walls closed in. A part of me had always wondered why my father left. Why he never looked back. But now I realized the truth. He hadn't left us. He had been running. And now, whatever he'd been running from had finally caught up. I looked at Samuel, my chest heaving. What do I do? Samuel's eyes darkened. You get out before it's too late. But my father only smiled. And that terrified me more than anything. Samuel's warning echoed in my head. You get out before it's too late. But my father just stood there, unbothered, smiling, like he already knew something I didn't. I took another step back, but he didn't follow. He just watched me, studied me, like he was trying to figure out exactly how much of my mother I had in me. And how much of him? Dad, I said, my voice tight, my pulse pounding. Tell me the truth. Now, his expression didn't change. I already did. No, you didn't. My throat felt tight. You said you did everything for me. What does that even mean? Samuel answered before he could. It means he made deals with people who don't forgive debts. I looked at Samuel. His face was unreadable, but his grip on the back of a chair was white-knuckled. He wasn't just angry. He was furious. My father exhaled. Still playing the hero, I see. Samuel ignored him. He turned to me, his gaze steady. Your father didn't leave because he wanted to. He left because he had no choice. Silence. A slow, sharp dread curled in my stomach. What do you mean? I whispered. Samuel glanced at my father, then back at me. I mean, the night he left, he wasn't just abandoning you and your mother. His voice was razor-sharp now. He was running from the people who wanted him dead. A cold chill washed over me. My father sighed like this conversation was exhausting him. This is all unnecessary. Samuel's voice cut through like steel. Then tell her, Vincent, tell her who you really are. I turned back to my father, waiting. My heart was hammering, my nails digging into my palms. He finally met my gaze. And then, with terrifying calm, he said, I used to kill people for a living. The air left my lungs. My father, I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the table to keep myself upright. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in, the chandelier lights too bright. That's not true, I whispered. It couldn't be. Samuel didn't flinch. It is. I shook my head, my stomach twisting. My father, a murderer? My father sighed, rolling his shoulders like he was loosening tension. Hitman, assassin, enforcer, whatever word you prefer, sweetheart. It's all the same. The way he said it, casually, like it was just another job. My body felt like it was floating, untethered, drifting between reality and something much worse. You're lying? I croaked. He took a slow step forward. Am I? Samuel was suddenly between us. His voice dropped. Don't. For the first time, I saw it. The shift in my father's expression. Something cold. Calculating. He was testing me. Watching my reaction. Measuring how much of his blood ran in my veins. And I hated it. I straightened, forcing my voice to steady. Why now? Why come back after all these years? His lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. Because someone had to warn you. I stilled. Warn me. Samuel exhaled sharply. Vincent, don't. But my father ignored him. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. They're coming for you. My breath caught. Who? He tilted his head, looking at me like I should already know the answer. The people who wanted me dead. I swallowed hard. That doesn't make sense. Why would they come for me? My father held my gaze. Because you're my daughter. The words were a death sentence. The room was silent, but my ears were ringing. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I turned to Samuel. Tell me he's lying. Samuel didn't answer. That was enough to answer enough. Everything inside me felt like it was caving in. My wedding. My life. Everything I thought I knew. Shattered in a matter of minutes. I turned back to my father, my voice hoarse. What do they want? His smirk faded. Leverage. The words settled in my bones like ice. My stomach turned. You mean, they'll use you to get to me? His voice was calm. Too calm. Like he had already accepted it. And they won't stop until I'm either dead or back under their control. Samuel cursed under his breath. I clenched my fists, anger rising above the fear. So what? You just show up and expect me to run with you? My father smiled. I expect you to survive. The words hung heavy in the air. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. None of this was real. None of it could be. But then Samuel spoke again. His voice was quiet, but lethal. They've already found her, haven't they? My father's silence was all the confirmation we needed. Samuel exhaled, his jaw tightening. Then he turned to me, his voice sharp. Pack your bags. We leave tonight. My father smirked. Now you're talking. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Because something told me, no matter what I did, no matter where I went, this wasn't going to end with an escape. This was going to end with a reckoning. I should have run. I should have grabbed my husband's hand, bolted out of that ballroom, and never looked back. But I didn't, because some deep, twisted part of me needed to see how this ended. Samuel's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. We don't have much time. If they've already found her, I know, my father said, his tone unervingly calm. I snapped my gaze to him. Stop talking like I'm not standing right here. My breath was ragged, my pulse racing. Who are these people? What do they want? Samuel was the one who answered. The Sovereign Syndicate. A lead weight settled in my stomach. I had heard whispers of them before. A network of criminals, elites who operated in the shadows, who ran entire cities without ever showing their faces. I turned to my father, my voice unsteady. You work for them? He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. I was their best. Until I walked away. You don't just walk away from them, Vincent, Samuel snapped. You know that. Something dark flickered in my father's eyes. I didn't have a choice. Silence. Heavy and suffocating. Samuel muttered a curse under his breath, then turned to me. We leave now. No arguments. But before I could move, before I could even breathe, the lights cut out. The entire ballroom plunged into darkness. A sharp gasp rippled through the remaining guests. Then gunfire. Screams erupted as bullets tore through the air, shattering glass, splintering wood. I dove, hitting the marble floor hard, my dress tangling around my legs. Someone crashed into a table. Someone else was crying. Strong hands grabbed me, Samuel's. Stay low, he hissed. More gunfire. Then the unmistakable sound of bodies hitting the ground. I turned my head, just barely making out the silhouette of my father. Moving. Fast. I should have been afraid. I should have been horrified. But all I felt was cold, numbing clarity. My father hadn't come to ruin my wedding. He had come to warn me. And now, the people he had spent his life running from had come to collect their debt. Samuel yanked me behind an overturned table as another round of gunfire shattered a chandelier. Sparks rained down like falling stars. I need you to listen to me, he said, voice sharp. When I say run, a figure emerged from the darkness. Fast. Silent. Samuel turned just as the man lunged. I barely had time to react before Samuel was fighting for his life. A knife flashed. A sharp grunt. The two of them crashed against a chair, sending it skidding across the floor. My breath came in sharp gasps. Then, another movement, a shadow breaking through the chaos, heading straight for me. I scrambled back, heart slamming against my ribs. No, 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 no. A gunshot split the air. The man jerked back, staggered, then collapsed. I spun, chest heaving. My father stood a few feet away, gun raised. His expression was eerily calm, like taking a life meant nothing. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, his mouth quivered at the corner. You should thank me. I felt sick. This was normal for him. Killing, surviving, escaping. And now I was a part of it. Samuel finally overpowered his attacker, slamming the man's head into the floor. He turned to me, breathing heavily. We have to go. Now. I hesitated. My father took a step forward. You have two choices, he said, voice even. Come with me, and I will keep you safe. Or stay, and you die. I hated him for saying it so simply, but I hated myself even more for believing him. Samuel's hand found my wrist. A silent plea. I had to decide. Now, do I run with the man who abandoned me? Or do I trust the man who just found me? I turned to Samuel. Will you protect me? His eyes darkened. With everything I have. That was all I needed. I stepped towards Samuel, away from my father. Vincent's expression flickered, just for a second. A brief crack in his mask. Then just as quickly it was gone. Bad choice, he murmured. Then he was gone, melted into the shadows. Samuel tightened his grip on my wrist. We have to move. We pushed through the wreckage, stepping over broken glass, dodging the bodies of the men who had tried to kill us. The night air hit me like a slap as we burst through the ballroom doors, my dress torn, my heart still racing. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. Because I knew, deep in my bones, this wasn't over. My father was still out there, and the Sovereign Syndicate wasn't done with me yet. 3 months later, I stood at the edge of a private airstrip, the wind whipping my hair. Samuel leaned against a black SUV, arms crossed. Are you sure about this? No, but I nodded anyway. I need to see him. Samuel exhaled sharply, but didn't argue. A sleek jet was waiting on the tarmac. The door opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. Vincent. He was dressed in black, his face unreadable as he approached. You came. I swallowed hard. What? A small smirk. You already know why. I hated that he was right. The Sovereign Syndicate wasn't gone. They would never be gone. And as long as my father was in the wind, I would never be safe. So I had a choice. Run for the rest of my life. Or end this. Vincent studied me, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, silver object. A gun. He held it out. Tom had aside, sweetheart. I stared at the weapon. At the man who had once called himself my father. Then, slowly, I reached for it. Samuel didn't stop me. Vincent grinned. Proud. I tightened my grip and made my choice. The past would never stop chasing me, so I would stop it first.